In 2002, 28 Days Later redefined the apocalypse, not with undead corpses, but with living rage. It's a gritty, raw, and deeply human story about what happens when civilization collapses and we're left to confront both monsters outside and the monsters within. The digital release of the film and the recent trailer for 28 Years Later, it's the perfect time to take a closer look at what makes this film such an endearing classic. Directed by DannyBoyle and written by Alex Garland, this film redefined and reinvigorated the genre. It didn't just stumble onto the scene, it sprinted, bringing with it a new kind of terror that lingers on in many that have come since, like The Walking Dead, The Last of Us, Train to Busan, All of Us Are Dead, and even Shaun of the Dead.
That the virus was caused by rage-infected monkeys have now been dismissed as...
But for years it has been stuck in legal hell, unable to be released on digital and hard to get your hands on a physical copy. Now that it's finally accessible to the masses, I dusted off my long-forgotten copy that I honestly have no idea how it came to be in my possession, and watched it with fresh eyes. Come with me as I break it down and dive deep into its themes and characters, because this film is much more than a zombie movie. In fact, that part has been hotly debated amongst horror fans, given the nature of the live infected versus the traditionally undead that a lot of people think of with zombie movies. I personally like to think of it as an apocalyptic science fiction horror thriller, but you're free to debate me in the comments below. Before 28 Days Later, zombies were slow, shuffling metaphors for the darkest aspects of humanity and consumerism. Think Romero's Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead. But Boyle's Infected changed the game. They were alive, fast, relentless, and filled with primal rage. The movie effectively bridged classic zombie horror with modern survival realism. This was also one of the first horror films to address pandemics and societal collapse in a visceral, grounded way. Unlike the bombastic, action-packed stories of today, this movie truly shines in its most intimate moments. So many people will get to experience it for the first time, or like me, be inspired to revisit it after so many years. But in the modern era of crystal-clear imagery, many will undoubtedly notice its low-def visual style. The film's gritty, almost documentary-like feel comes from being shot on digital video instead of traditional film. This allowed the crew to capture iconic shots of an abandoned London without shutting down the city for long periods of time. They filmed those scenes early in the morning with the help of police blocking traffic. In some cases, they had mere minutes to get the shot, and being set in the UK, the grainy look mirrored the look of digital CCTV footage, which the filmmakers made reference to in the making of special included on the DVD. Everything about the film is so authentically British, which adds to its grounded nature and believability, being set in an isolated society that could easily be cut off from the outside world, and where gun ownership is far less common than the US, so hopefully people won't be put off by the look and the sound. With a budget of just $8 million, the film raked in over $82 million worldwide, making it a massive financial success for the time. The minimal resources added to the raw, desperate tone of the story. The virus was inspired by real-world diseases like Ebola and rabies, giving it a terrifying, plausible edge. The concept of rage as a contagious disease feels uncomfortably relevant today. In the making of, the filmmakers and actors reflect on the likelihood of a global pandemic, stating it was not a matter of if, but when, something that feels so eerie and surreal in the wake of 2020. It makes perfect sense that Boyle and Garland were inspired to continue the story in 28 Years Later, given what we all just went through. This was also Cillian Murphy's breakout role as Jim, propelling him to stardom. Similarly, Naomi Harris, who plays Selena, gives a phenomenal portrayal of a female character that feels real, which seems so desperately needed today, where too many are relegated to one-note planks of wood who aren't relatable at all. Selena's initial cold pragmatism softens over time, while Jim transforms from a wide-eyed innocent into something capable of unspeakable violence to protect others. And despite Brendan Gleeson's smaller role in the film as Frank, his veteran acting ability shines through in its most warm and heartbreaking moment. Zombie or apocalypse movies literally live and die by their cast, and with so few characters in the film, it's an amazing feat of casting and character writing that draws you in, makes you care, and tears you down as the story unfolds. But it's not the infected that destroy society, it's the humans themselves. 28 Days Later is as much about retaining humanity in the face of chaos as it is about survival. The movie starkly portrays how quickly society can crumble when panic takes over. In one of the most effective and memorable openings in horror history, the story begins with a chaotic scene with animal rights activists breaking into what appears to be an experimental facility. A chimp strapped to a table, being forced to watch footage of humans at our worst. While their intentions might be noble, they ignore the pleas of the scientist on duty and unwittingly unleash the RageVirus, a disease that turns its hosts into feral, bloodthirsty maniacs. Fast forward 28 days, in one of the most brilliantly subtle placements for a movie title, we meet Jim, a bike courier recovering from an accident who awakens alone in a hospital to find London deserted. You have to admire Murphy's comfort to be shown completely nude, and not just this once. It adds weight to the fragile and vulnerable position he's in at the start of the film. The iconic imagery of Jim wandering the empty streets, stunned by the absence of life, perfectly capture the disorienting horror of isolation. Just don't get distracted by the incredibly noticeable Pepsi product placements scattered throughout the film. Jim seeks sanctuary, literally, as he wanders into a church, but what should be his salvation almost leads to his doom. He learns the hard way that he's not truly alone, and we get the first glimpse at what the infected are capable of. This is where the terror really ramps up. Jim is rescued by Selena and Mark, who explain the virus's rapid spread and the collapse of the UK. The brilliance of Garland's script is how much we're able to learn by hearing so little. They show a great deal of restraint when it comes to explaining about the virus and the outside world. They don't really know how far it spread, but Selena's clear description of how it works is key for establishing peak verisimilitude. When Jim insists on knowing the fate of his family, he finds them, his parents, in a heartbreaking reveal clutching a photo of him as a child. Their last words written on the back of the photo: "They left him sleeping, and now can be with him." But just in case, their final wish was that he don't wake up. The amount of fear and despair that would bring his parents to wish that is beautifully portrayed, but Selena sees it different. Of course it would be too fresh for Jim, both their death and the world he's woken up to. Mark emphasizes the realities he will face when he recounts his own family's demise. Boyle's direction keeps the shots close. In an almost suffocating way, you wish he would pull back, but that would undercut the dark intimacy of what the characters have been through in the 28 days that Jim has been asleep. At this point, we've learned just enough about Mark to make us feel the impact of his demise after Jim, still ignorant to the ways of the infected, lights a candle and their group is attacked. The way Selena ruthlessly kills Mark after he is bitten is a key character moment for her. Her cold, pragmatic, and survival-at-all-costs mindset clash with Jim's innocence and shock. She's explained the risk that comes from the blood, but we see her mercilessly hack away at Mark without any concern for herself. It leaves you wondering, how could she not get infected? She asks Jim if any blood got in his mouth in a way that makes it seem like she's completely dissociated with what she's just done. To rise above the monsters, must we abandon our humanity? Left with no choice but to move at night, there comes a glimmer of hope, but they'll have to work for it. Follow Naomi's example and make sure to keep up with your cardio because Jim's 28 days in the hospital almost does him in.
Rule number 1 for surviving Zombieland: cardio.
Boyle knows when to ramp things up and when the characters, and the audience for that matter, need a reprieve. Every good thriller and horror movie has this kind of pacing. The introduction of Frank and his daughter Hannah is brilliantly crafted. Frank is such a warm yet capable presence, it almost makes you forget the circumstances they face outside their door. He's hopeful because he hasn't lost the most important thing that keeps him tethered to that hope, the love for his daughter. Frank believes salvation may lie in a military broadcast promising safety and the answer to the infection. The writing does such a great job showing us how necessary it is for them to move on. This scene also works as a great way to showcase the character progression. Jim starts as a confused and helpless outsider. Selena is introduced as hardened and emotionally detached, embodying survival over sentiment. But Frank and Hannah represent the remnants of normalcy and familial love in a broken world. Now that they have each other, they don't have to face the journey alone. The group's road trip to the military outpost is fraught with danger, but also moments of humanity. Every pit stop, every obstacle has a point that shines a light on who these characters are. Hannah could have come off as a helpless, whiny teenager, but she's clearly been raised by a father who has taken the time to teach her usable skills that come in handy to help the group escape the city. But it's not all doom and gloom. The side quest to the fully stocked grocery store is one of my favorite moments. It's so upbeat and provides some great levity that doesn't seem forced. That's one thing you gotta love about British movies, the humor found in the most inappropriate times, which is usually when we need it the most. The beauty of the British countryside is magnified by the peaceful emptiness, as if the land is returning back to a time before mankind. They stop to share a meal and laugh together, a rare respite that underscores their fragile bond. Yet the horrors of the world remain close. Jim must kill an infected child when he goes poking around in a place he should have known better not to enter. It's a haunting act that marks his first step towards transformation. His nightmare of waking up again in a field, totally alone, speaks volumes. Despite the apocalyptic sight of Manchester burning in the distance, the military refuge initially seems promising, but when no one emerges to greet them, Frank's hope is shattered. In a very real moment of human vulnerability, we see this strong father figure crumble at the thought that this was all for nothing. In what is one of the most haunting ways to get infected ever shown in the genre, a drop of blood from an infected crow, a symbol of death in many cultures, falls in his eye, sealing his fate. Brendan Gleeson handles the back and forth expression of emotion beautifully. In what is such a sweet and gentle final "I love you" to his daughter, he begins to succumb to rage. Just when you think they'll be forced to take him out, the British Army arrives to take care of it for them, at what seems to give a new meaning to the rule of double tapping. It's also a chilling sign of what's to come. They appear to be saved, but it came at a great cost to Hannah. The army is revealed to only be a small batch of soldiers who have fortified a large British estate. Major Henry West and his band of soldiers offer food and the illusion of hope. But the cracks quickly show. The soldiers are shown to be undisciplined, disrespectful, and unnervingly comfortable in this apocalyptic chaos. And with that, Jim begins shedding his innocence, showing his capacity for violence to protect others. Selena starts to trust Jim, allowing herself to hope again despite her fears. We also learn she was a chemist before the outbreak, a detail that will be important later. The tragedy that strikes when Frank becomes infected in a random accident highlights the fragility of life, and while Hannah is strong, she's now alone with only the kindness of two people she's just met to cling to. As Jim gets the lay of the land, it's revealed they are keeping an infected one of their own to learn what they can about the virus, in a brilliant bit of setup that will be paid off later. There's a seemingly inconsequential line drop in a one-on-one conversation that is quite the opposite. Major West tells Jim,
"You're quite safe here."
This will turn out to be purposeful, because for all intents and purposes, he's telling the truth. Jim is safe. As they will soon find out, that safety doesn't extend to Selena and Hannah. He reveals their true intentions and the meaning behind the answer to infection.
I promised them women.
Major West's promise of safety for Jim, but not for Selena and Hannah, underscores the film's deeper horror. It's not the infected that are the ultimate threat. It's humanity's capacity for cruelty. In a twisted speech that is delivered with chilling sincerity by Christopher Eccleston, that is why he made the broadcast. But they don't intend to harmoniously live together and build a community. They intend to take them by force in some twisted means to rebuild civilization, made even more detestable given that Hannah is basically still a child. This horrifying revelation forces our main trio to confront the true nature of survival, and Major West's reasoning in the first place, discovering one of his soldiers preparing to end himself. Instead, he would give them a future. But what kind of future is that? To end your pain, would you inflict pain onto others, especially in a way that would make them want to turn around and do the exact same thing you were planning to do to yourself? Because believe me, this would be a fate worse than death to most women. That's why stories like The Handmaid's Tale resonate to this day, regardless of how you feel about it being co-opted as a symbol for other things. And so you have your way with the women. What then? Do you really expect men like this to raise these children? Will the women be slaves to reproduce multiple times? As he states, women mean a future. But what kind of future would this lead to? As a woman watching this film, it hits different. Selena and Hannah's lack of safety underscores the grotesque de-evolution and lack of morality that often emerges in post-apocalyptic scenarios. It's a theme that has been depicted far too many times in media. Not that you can't handle it at all, but male filmmakers need to be aware of how women will be affected seeing it depicted on screen. The same can certainly be said for SA inflicted on male characters. Unlike many horror films and thrillers that came out in this era, DannyBoyle shows great restraint in the scene to come. He shows that the threat can be enough. In the special features, he emphasizes that the virus doesn't create the rage. It brings out what is already in us, what we are capable of. For these men, there's a good chance it was hiding beneath the surface all along, but societal law and order kept it in check. You can clearly see this in how one of the men describes Selena, but in other men, good and decent men like Jim, Sergeant Farrell, and Frank, lies the difference. That a man, a true and good man, must protect those who cannot protect themselves. It's a moment that forces Jim to take action, and not just against the infected, but against the worst aspects of human nature. Selena's resolve and motherly instinct to protect Hannah, even if that means drugging her to numb the pain, is a powerful show of strength. In this moment, she doesn't have the physical strength to get them out of the situation, but she uses what she has, her intellect, to buy them time, even if she doesn't know if Jim will return. When Jim is nearly executed, he escapes and uses the infected soldier to his advantage, unleashing him on the others. This is where Jim's transformation reaches its peak. He becomes a feral, unstoppable force, mirroring the infected in his rage-fueled quest to save Selena and Hannah. And of course, Cillian Murphy has to do it all laid bare again. Once reunited, Selena hesitates to kill Jim, fearing he might be infected. This reflects her own growth. She no longer sees the world in purely black and white. Survival and humanity can coexist, and she wants to do so with him. It's her choice, and he steps in the line of fire for her. The climactic moment comes when Hannah, using the driving skills she learned from her dad and the hazy courage brought on by the Valium, kills Major West. When we have other tools at our disposal, women can be just as deadly. But their successful escape is not without a good old-fashioned fake-out death. Cut to black, and the words, 28 days later. In the film's epilogue, Jim lives. They have found peace as a little found family in the countryside, and a new sense of hope in the form of a plane they've been trying to make contact with. Of course, this wasn't the original ending. In an ending they completed and tested, they show us Selena and Hannah's full effort to save Jim at an abandoned hospital. Selena, being a chemist, would have some remedial knowledge of medicine, especially the drugs needed. I honestly kind of wish they kept this part in the film, because Naomi gives a stellar performance, but it's better this way. In this ending, she can't save him. It ends as it began, Jim lying alone in a hospital bed. In the filmmaker's commentary, they expressed disappointment over how poorly this ending tested, and it forced them to save Jim. They liked the imagery of Selena and Hannah in a show of feminine strength, seeming like they would be okay. But when you have just shown us what could happen to these two women at the hands of evil men, I wouldn't have found this to be a satisfying ending either. Maybe in another story, but not this one. It also shows us that we need both men and women to survive. But we don't simply want to survive, we want to live and thrive in a manner of our choosing. Selena chooses Jim, and he chooses her back, which is beautifully depicted in the theatrical ending, with them smiling and full of hope. In closing, 28 Days Later is more than just a zombie or infected movie. It's a story about the human condition under pressure. The infected are terrifying, but the true horror lies in the choices people make when the veneer of civilization falls away. The best apocalyptic stories remind us that our humanity is our greatest strength and also our greatest vulnerability. Frank's death, Selena's guarded demeanor, and Jim's transformation all serve as reminders of what's at stake. Not just survival, but the preservation of what makes us human. As Jim fights to save Selena and Hannah, he proves that we cannot fall to rage. Giving into fear, anger, or violence risks losing what separates us from the infected. The final takeaway is clear. The heroes in stories like this don't become the monsters, but they will have to face them, and they might have to overcome themselves. They rise above loss, fear, and rage to show us that humanity's best traits, hope, love, and resilience, can endure even in the darkest of times. 28 Days Later isn't just about surviving an apocalypse. It's about what you're willing to do to remain human. The infected may be terrifying, but we have to ensure that we don't become the true villains. Of course, we can't forget there's a second film, 28 Weeks Later, but that's best left for another time. With 28 years later on the horizon, the question is, where do we go from here? The trailer shows us the UK is still grappling with the aftershock of the RageVirus. But what about the rest of the world? It'll be fascinating to see how the filmmakers address themes of generational trauma, rebuilding civilization, and of course, the evolving nature of fear. One thing is certain, rage doesn't die, it evolves. And let's be honest, if they can capture even half of the raw intensity of 28 Days Later, we're in for a real treat. But what do you think? Did 28 Days Later shake you to your core the first time you saw it? What are you hoping to see in 28 years later? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, stay human and stay cultured.